The champagne glass slipped from Marcus's hand when CEO Patricia Morgan called my name from the stage. 3 years of basement IT support, 3 years of being invisible at company meetings, 3 years of driving my dented Honda Civic while they flaunted their leased BMWs. And now, as 200 employees turned to stare at me in my department store dress, I realized the joke was finally on them. But let me start from the beginning, because the sweetest victories are the ones nobody sees coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The annual Meridian Technologies holiday party was supposed to be magical. That's what the company-wide email promised when it arrived 3 weeks ago, complete with gold lettering and promises of an evening at the rooftop at Union Station, downtown Denver's most exclusive venue, where the city lights sparkled through floor-to-ceiling windows, and the kind of people who mattered went to be seen. I stared at that email from my basement office, surrounded by humming servers and the faint smell of industrial carpet, wondering if I'd even bother showing up. Marcus Rodriguez made that decision for me during our department meeting the next morning. He leaned back in his chair, designer shirt perfectly pressed, and announced to the room that he'd reserved a table for the core team at the party. His eyes swept past me like I was furniture, landing on Jennifer Walsh from marketing and David Kim from sales. The three of them had formed their own little ecosystem at Meridian Technologies, grabbing drinks after work at trendy LoDo bars, organizing weekend ski trips to Vail, and generally treating the office like their personal networking club. "Sarah, you're welcome to sit with the support staff," Marcus said, his voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're being charitable. "I'm sure Tom Bradley and the maintenance crew would love the company." The room went quiet for exactly 3 seconds before someone coughed and the meeting continued. I nodded like it didn't matter, like being relegated to the kids' table was perfectly fine with me. Because in 3 weeks, when Patricia Morgan stepped up to that microphone, I wanted Marcus to remember this moment. I wanted him to remember how easily he dismissed me, how naturally he assumed I belonged in the basement with the forgotten people. That's the thing about being underestimated. People create their own version of you, and once they've decided who you are, they stop looking closely enough to notice when you change. For 6 months, I'd been living 2 completely different lives. Downstairs, I was Sarah Chen, the IT support specialist who fixed printer jams and reset passwords. The woman who ate lunch alone while scrolling through her phone, who left promptly at 5:30 every day, who drove a car that made concerning noises when it started. Upstairs, in the corner conference room with the mahogany table and the views of the Rocky Mountains, I was something else entirely. I was the person Patricia Morgan had personally selected to spearhead Meridian's expansion into artificial intelligence consulting. I was the candidate who'd spent months in confidential interviews, presenting strategies that would triple the company's revenue within 2 years. I was the future vice president of digital innovation, a position that didn't exist yet because they were creating it specifically for me. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Marcus spent his days managing social media campaigns for local restaurants and Jennifer coordinated trade show booths, I was designing the technological infrastructure that would make both of their departments obsolete. While David cold called potential clients from a list he bought online, I was having private dinners with government contractors who were ready to sign 8-figure deals. But none of them knew that. They saw the basement office, the modest clothes, the quiet demeanor, and they filled in the blanks with their own assumptions. Sarah Chen, the support person. Sarah Chen, the woman who'd probably never advance beyond her current role. Sarah Chen, who was grateful just to have a job at a company like Meridian. The weeks leading up to the party were a masterclass in casual cruelty. Marcus would stop by my desk to ask if I needed help understanding the big picture initiatives the company was working on. Jennifer would invite me to lunch with the group, then spend the entire meal talking about career strategies and networking opportunities I'd never get access to in my current position. David would pat my shoulder and tell me how lucky I was to have such a stable, low-stress job, while everyone else had to deal with the pressure of real responsibility. I smiled and nodded through all of it. I let them build their narrative, let them cast me as the supporting character in their success story, because I knew something they didn't. In 2 weeks, when Patricia Morgan announced the new Digital Innovation Division, when she revealed the candidate she'd personally mentored for this role, When she outlined the salary package that was triple what any of them made, their whole understanding of the hierarchy at Meridian Technologies would collapse. The day of the party arrived with the kind of December snow that makes Denver look like a postcard. I spent the morning in my basement office, fielding the usual requests. Marcus needed help with his laptop, which was running slowly because he'd installed about 30 unnecessary programs. Jennifer couldn't figure out why her presentation wasn't displaying correctly, despite the fact that she'd saved it in the wrong format. David wanted me to recover some files he'd accidentally deleted, then made a joke about how technical stuff was too complicated for normal people. Each interaction felt like a small goodbye. Tomorrow, everything would be different. Tomorrow, I'd have an office on the 15th floor with a view of the mountains. Tomorrow, I'd be attending meetings where the real decisions were made, where the future of the company was planned, where my input would actually matter. But today, I was still invisible. I went home to my apartment in Capitol Hill, a modest one-bedroom that I'd been renting for 3 years. The walls were decorated with my computer science degree from UC Berkeley, my master's in artificial intelligence from Stanford, and a few certificates from specialized training programs that had cost more than most people's cars. Credentials that none of my colleagues had ever bothered to ask about. Qualifications that would have answered every question about why Patricia Morgan had chosen me for this role. I stood in front of my closet, considering my options. I could wear the black dress I'd bought for my cousin's wedding, the one that made me look professional without being flashy. I could do my hair in the simple style I wore to work every day, apply the minimal makeup that had become my signature look. I could show up to this party looking exactly like the person they expected me to be. Or I could give them something to remember. I chose the black dress, but I paired it with the pearl necklace my grandmother had given me, the one I'd been saving for special occasions. I spent extra time on my makeup, not enough to look like I was trying too hard, but enough to remind people that I was a woman who cared about how she presented herself. I styled my hair in a way that looked effortless, but had actually taken 40 minutes to perfect. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone who belonged in that corner conference room, someone who could command attention when she needed to. Someone who was ready for whatever came next. The rooftop at Union Station was everything the email had promised. The venue stretched across the top floor of the historic building, with panoramic views of downtown Denver and the mountains beyond. String lights created a warm atmosphere against the winter sky, and servers in black uniforms moved through the crowd carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvre. The company had rented the entire space, and 200 employees were scattered across the room in various clusters, the natural hierarchies of office life playing out in real time. I arrived exactly on time, not early enough to look desperate, not late enough to miss anything important. The coat check attendant smiled when she took my jacket, and I realized this was probably the first time in months that someone had looked at me without preconceived notions about who I was or what I was worth. The first person I saw was Tom Bradley, the maintenance supervisor, standing near the bar with 2 other guys from his department. Tom was one of the few people at Meridian who had always treated me with genuine respect, maybe because he understood what it was like to be overlooked by the corporate crowd. He waved me over, and I made my way through the crowd, nodding to colleagues who barely acknowledged my presence. "Sarah!" "You clean up nice," Tom said, raising his beer in a mock toast. "Fancy place, huh?" "Makes me feel like I should be fixing something instead of drinking their champagne." I laughed, genuinely grateful for his easy humor. "You deserve to be here as much as anyone else, Tom. More than some people, actually." He tilted his head, studying my face. "You seem different tonight. Good different. Like you've got a secret or something." If only he knew. Before I could respond, I heard Marcus's voice cutting through the ambient noise of the party. He was holding court near the windows, Jennifer and David flanking him like backup singers. Their laughter just a little too loud for the elegant setting. I could see them from across the room, and I realized they'd already had a few drinks. Their table was decorated with the kind of elaborate place settings that screamed VIP treatment, and they were clearly enjoying their status as the company's golden children. "Hey, Sarah," Marcus called out, his voice carrying enough to turn heads. "Come over here, we saved you a spot." I knew it was a trap, but I also knew it was necessary. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. The setup that would make the eventual reveal even more satisfying. I excused myself from Tom and made my way over to their table, feeling the weight of curious stares from other employees who were wondering why the IT support girl was being invited to sit with the cool kids. The spot they'd saved for me was a folding chair someone had pulled from another table, positioned slightly behind the main seating area like an afterthought. I sat down without comment, folding my hands in my lap and adopting the same quiet demeanor I'd perfected over the past 3 years. "So Sarah," Jennifer said, her voice saccharine sweet, "are you excited about the big announcements tonight? Patricia's supposed to reveal some major new initiatives." I nodded politely. "I'm sure it will be interesting." David leaned forward, his tie loosened from drinking. "You know, Sarah, I've been thinking about your career path. Have you ever considered trying to move out of technical support? I mean, you're obviously smart enough to handle more complex work." The condescension in his voice was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. Here was a man who'd needed my help recovering his files that morning, offering to mentor me on career advancement. "I'm pretty happy where I am," I said simply. Marcus nearly choked on his champagne. "Happy? Sarah, you've been in the same position for 3 years. Don't you want to grow? Don't you want to be part of the real action?" He gestured around the room, encompassing the party, the venue, the visible markers of success that surrounded us. "This is what advancement looks like. This is what happens when you take risks, when you put yourself out there, when you show leadership that you're ready for bigger things." Jennifer nodded enthusiastically. "Marcus is right. You have so much potential, but you're wasting it in that basement. You could be doing so much more with your life." The irony was exquisite. Here were 3 people who'd spent months treating me like I was invisible, suddenly concerned about my career development. Here were 3 people who'd never bothered to ask about my background, my education, or my ambitions, offering advice on how to achieve success. "What do you think I should be doing differently?" I asked, genuinely curious to hear their answer. David brightened, clearly excited to share his wisdom. "Well, first, you need to network more. You can't just sit in your office waiting for opportunities to come to you. You need to make yourself visible, get involved in high-profile projects, show people what you're capable of." Marcus nodded sagely. "Exactly. And you need to dress for the job you want, not the job you have. I mean, tonight you look great, but on a daily basis, you need to present yourself as someone who belongs in leadership." Jennifer leaned in conspiratorially. "And honestly, you need to be more confident. Stop being so quiet all the time. Speak up in meetings, share your ideas, make sure people know you're there." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I listened to their advice with the same polite attention I'd been giving them for months. They had no idea that I'd been doing exactly what they suggested, just not in a way they could see. They had no idea that I'd been networking with CEOs and government contractors, that I'd been involved in the highest profile project in the company's history, that I'd been presenting myself as leadership material to the person who actually mattered. They had no idea that in 30 minutes, everything they thought they knew about me would be proven wrong. "Those are really good suggestions," I said. "I'll definitely think about that." Marcus raised his glass in a mock toast. "Here's to Sarah's future success. May she finally break out of that basement and join the rest of us in the real world." The table erupted in laughter, the kind of laughter that sounds supportive but carries an undercurrent of mockery. Other employees at nearby tables turned to look, and I realized this moment was being witnessed by half the party. Perfect. I raised my water glass and smiled. "To the future," I said simply. As we drank, I caught sight of Patricia Morgan near the stage, checking her watch and conferring with her assistant. The CEO was a woman in her early 50s who commanded respect without raising her voice, who'd built Meridian Technologies from a small startup into a major player in the consulting industry. She was also the woman who'd spent 6 months preparing me for this moment, who'd coached me through presentations and strategy sessions, who'd told me just last week that I was going to revolutionize the company's approach to digital innovation. In 15 minutes, she would take that stage and announce the creation of the Digital Innovation Division. She would outline the strategic vision for Meridian's future, the plans that would position the company as a leader in artificial intelligence consulting. She would reveal the massive government contracts we'd secured, the partnerships with major tech companies, the revenue projections that would make every investor in the room very happy. And then she would introduce me as the vice president, who would lead this transformation. But for now, I was still just Sarah Chen, the IT support specialist who was grateful to be included at the cool kids table. For now, I was still the woman who fixed their computers and reset their passwords, who drove a dented Honda Civic and ate lunch alone in the basement. For now, I was still invisible. Marcus was telling a story about a client meeting where he'd supposedly saved a major account through his quick thinking, his voice getting louder as the champagne took effect. Jennifer was nodding along, occasionally adding details that made Marcus look even more heroic. David was scrolling through his phone, probably checking his dating apps, occasionally laughing at inappropriate moments. None of them were paying attention to the stage, where Patricia Morgan was now standing behind the podium, tapping the microphone to get the room's attention. None of them noticed that the ambient music had stopped, that the servers had paused their rounds, that 200 employees were gradually turning toward the front of the room. I noticed. I'd been waiting for this moment for 6 months, and every cell in my body was buzzing with anticipation. Good evening, everyone. Patricia's voice carried easily through the sound system. Thank you for joining us for what I know will be a truly memorable evening. The room quieted, conversations dying out as people realized the formal program was beginning. I felt Marcus's hand on my shoulder, a gesture that would have seemed friendly to any observer but felt patronizing to me. This should be good, he whispered. Patricia always has interesting announcements at these things. If only he knew how interesting this particular announcement was going to be. Patricia continued, her voice warm but commanding. This year has been transformative for Meridian Technologies. We've grown by 40%, expanded into new markets, and established ourselves as a leader in our field. But tonight I want to talk about the future. She clicked a remote, and the screen behind her displayed a sleek presentation slide with the company logo and the words Digital Innovation Initiative in bold letters. The world is changing rapidly, Patricia said. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, and advanced data analytics are no longer futuristic concepts. They're the present reality of business success, and Meridian Technologies is going to lead that transformation. I felt my heart rate increase. This was it. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the moment that would change everything. To spearhead this initiative, Patricia continued, I've created a new position, Vice President of Digital Innovation. This person will oversee our expansion into AI consulting, manage our partnerships with major tech companies, and lead the teams that will define our company's future. Marcus straightened in his chair, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. A new VP position meant new opportunities, new hierarchies, new chances for advancement. I watched him glance around the room, probably wondering which of the existing managers would be promoted to this role. This decision wasn't made lightly, Patricia said. I needed someone with exceptional technical expertise, someone who understood both the technological possibilities and the business applications, someone who could think strategically while also understanding the practical implementation challenges. Jennifer was now paying attention too, her champagne glass forgotten as she focused on the stage. David had put his phone away, realizing that this announcement might actually affect his career prospects. I needed someone who could work with government contractors, who could present to Fortune 500 executives, who could design systems that would scale across multiple industries, Patricia continued. Someone who combined technical mastery with business acumen, who could build teams and manage complex projects. The room was completely silent now, everyone hanging on every word. I could feel the tension at our table, the anticipation of learning who would be elevated to this prestigious new role. Most importantly, Patricia said, her voice carrying a note of personal pride, I needed someone who was already thinking like a leader, someone who was ready to take on this challenge immediately. She paused, letting the suspense build. I knew what was coming next, but my hands were still trembling slightly as I reached for my water glass. Ladies and gentlemen, Patricia announced, her voice clear and strong. I'm thrilled to introduce Meridian Technologies' new Vice President of Digital Innovation, Sarah Chen. The champagne glass slipped from Marcus's hand and shattered against the floor. The silence that followed Patricia's announcement stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 seconds. 200 faces turned toward our table, searching for the woman who had just been named Vice President of Digital Innovation. I stood slowly, deliberately, my movements measured and calm despite the chaos erupting around me. Marcus sat frozen, staring at the broken champagne glass at his feet, as if it might somehow reassemble itself and undo what had just happened. Jennifer's mouth had fallen open in a way that would have been comical if I hadn't been the target of her condescension for the past 3 years. David was blinking rapidly, his brain clearly struggling to process information that didn't fit with his understanding of the world. "Sarah?" Jennifer whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing murmur of conversation throughout the room. "Sarah Chen? From IT?" I smoothed my dress and began walking toward the stage, each step deliberate and confident. The crowd parted as I moved through them, and I could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes following my progress. Conversations buzzed around me as people tried to make sense of what they'd just heard. "Isn't that the girl from the basement? I thought she just fixed computers. How did we not know about this?" Patricia watched me approach with a smile that held genuine warmth and professional pride. When I reached the stage, she extended her hand to help me up the steps, a gesture that felt both ceremonial and deeply personal. We'd rehearsed this moment during our preparation sessions, but experiencing it in front of the entire company was something else entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia said into the microphone, her arm around my shoulders, "Sarah has been working with me personally for the past 6 months to develop the strategic vision for our digital innovation division. She brings not only exceptional technical expertise, but also the leadership skills necessary to guide Meridian into the future." The applause started slowly, uncertain, as people tried to reconcile the woman on stage with the quiet IT support specialist they thought they knew. But as Patricia continued speaking, outlining my background and qualifications, the clapping grew stronger and more confident. "Sarah holds a master's degree in artificial intelligence from Stanford University and has been personally selected to lead our expansion into government contracting and Fortune 500 consulting services. Under her leadership, we've already secured preliminary agreements worth over $50 million in the first year alone." I stepped forward to the microphone, my hands steady despite the surreal nature of the moment. Looking out over the crowd, I could see the exact moment when the reality of the situation began to sink in for various groups of people. Some looked impressed, others confused, but everyone was paying attention in a way they never had before. "Thank you, Patricia," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "And thank you all for being here tonight. I know this announcement comes as a surprise to many of you, and I understand why. For the past 3 years, you've known me as the person who fixes your printers and resets your passwords. What you didn't know is that those same technical skills, combined with strategic thinking and business development, can create something much larger." I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the room, making brief contact with faces I recognized. The Digital Innovation Division will transform how Meridian Technologies approaches client services. We'll be implementing artificial intelligence solutions for major corporations, developing predictive analytics for government agencies, and creating automated systems that will revolutionize entire industries. From the stage, I had a perfect view of Marcus, Jennifer, and David's table. Marcus was still staring at the broken glass, his face pale under the warm lighting. Jennifer had recovered enough to close her mouth, but her expression was a mixture of shock and something that looked like betrayal, as if I had somehow deceived her by not announcing my qualifications during casual conversation. David was looking around the room, probably trying to gauge how this development might affect his own standing in the company hierarchy. "This initiative represents the largest expansion in Meridian's history," I continued. "We'll be hiring 30 new employees over the next 6 months, establishing partnerships with major technology companies, and opening satellite offices in San Francisco and Austin. The revenue projections for the first 3 years exceed the company's current annual earnings." The room erupted in genuine applause this time. the kind of enthusiastic response that accompanies news of growth and opportunity. I could see people throughout the crowd starting to understand the magnitude of what Patricia was announcing, and more importantly, beginning to grasp that the quiet woman from the basement had been the architect of this expansion all along. Patricia returned to the microphone as the applause died down. Sarah will be moving to the executive floor on Monday, where she'll have a team of 12 direct reports and a budget that reflects the scope of this initiative. She'll also be joining the board of directors and participating in all strategic planning decisions for the company moving forward. I thanked Patricia and made my way back down from the stage, but the dynamic in the room had fundamentally shifted. People who had never spoken to me before were approaching with congratulations and questions. Managers from other departments were introducing themselves and expressing interest in collaborative projects. Even senior executives who had previously treated me as invisible were making eye contact and nodding with newfound respect. But I wasn't ready to accept their sudden attention just yet. I had unfinished business at a particular table near the windows. Marcus had managed to move the broken glass to one side by the time I returned, but he was still sitting in the same position, staring at the tablecloth as if it held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. Jennifer and David were whispering to each other, their voices urgent and low. When they saw me approaching, the conversation stopped abruptly. "Well," I said, settling back into the folding chair they'd provided for me. "That was unexpected." Marcus finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine for perhaps the first time in 3 years. "Sarah, we had no idea. Why didn't you tell us you were working on something like this?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been anticipating. Would you have believed me if I had told you? 6 months ago, if I'd mentioned that I was meeting with Patricia about becoming a vice president, what would your reaction have been? The silence at the table answered my question more effectively than words could have. We all knew exactly what their reaction would have been. Laughter, probably. Gentle correction about the importance of staying realistic. Suggestions that I focus on advancing within my current department before setting my sights so high. Jennifer cleared her throat, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I just don't understand how this happened without anyone knowing. I mean, we work in the same building. We see each other every day." "You saw what you expected to see," I said simply. "You saw someone who fixed your technical problems and attended the meetings she was required to attend. You didn't see someone who might have additional capabilities or ambitions because it didn't occur to you to look." David leaned forward, his tie still loosened from earlier drinking. "But Sarah, this changes everything. I mean, you're going to be an executive now. You're going to be making major decisions that affect all of us." There was something in his voice that I recognized immediately. Fear. Not fear of change or uncertainty, but fear of accountability. David was realizing that the person he'd been casually dismissing for 3 years was about to have significant influence over his career trajectory. "Yes," I agreed. "I suppose it does change things." Marcus was studying my face intently, as if he could somehow read the past 6 months in my expression. "The government contracts Patricia mentioned, the Fortune 500 clients. You were working on all of that while you thought I was just the IT girl who wasn't smart enough to advance beyond technical support?" I finished for him. "Yes, I was working on all of that. The preliminary contracts are already signed, the partnerships are already established. The team I'll be managing has already been recruited, they just don't start until Monday." Jennifer's champagne glass was shaking slightly in her hand. "Sarah, about earlier tonight when we were giving you advice about your career, we didn't know." "You were trying to be helpful," I said, though we all knew that wasn't entirely true. "You were sharing your perspective based on your understanding of my situation. I appreciate the thought, even if the premise was incorrect." The conversation was interrupted by Tom Bradley, who appeared at our table with a genuine smile and a fresh beer. "Sarah, congratulations. I always knew you were too smart for that basement office. This is incredible news." His enthusiasm was infectious and completely sincere, a stark contrast to the awkward tension that had settled over the rest of the table. Tom had never treated me as anything less than an equal, never assumed that my job title defined my capabilities, never made me feel like I needed to prove my worth in casual conversations. "Thank you, Tom, that means a lot coming from you." He raised his beer in a toast. Here's to the smartest person at Meridian Technologies, finally getting the recognition she deserves. As Tom walked away, the contrast between his reaction and that of my tablemates became even more pronounced. The people who had never bothered to get to know me were struggling to process this new information, while the person who had treated me with consistent respect was genuinely celebrating my success. Marcus was now looking around the room, probably noticing for the first time how many people were approaching me with congratulations, how many senior executives were making note of who I was, how fundamentally the social dynamics of the company had shifted in the span of a single announcement. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. We all do. We made assumptions about you that were obviously wrong, and we treated you in a way that was inappropriate." It was the closest thing to genuine remorse I'd heard from him, but it also highlighted something important. Marcus wasn't apologizing because he'd realized his behavior was wrong in principle. He was apologizing because the revelation of my new position had made him understand that his behavior had been strategically unwise. "I appreciate that, Marcus," I said. "But I think what's more important is understanding why those assumptions were made in the first place. What was it about me that made you so certain I couldn't be working on something significant?" The question hung in the air, forcing them to confront the unconscious biases that had shaped their perceptions. I wasn't loud or self-promotional. I didn't make a show of working late or complain about being overwhelmed. I didn't dress in obvious displays of ambition or pepper my conversations with strategic buzzwords. Therefore, I must not be ambitious or capable of strategic thinking. Jennifer set down her champagne glass and looked directly at me for what felt like the first time all evening. "You're right. We did make assumptions, and those assumptions said more about us than they did about you." It was a more thoughtful response than I'd expected from her, and I found myself reassessing my opinion of Jennifer's capacity for self-reflection. Perhaps the shock of the evening was forcing all of them to examine their own behavior more critically. David, however, was already moving past introspection toward more practical concerns. "So what happens now? I mean, with the new division and everything? Are there going to be opportunities for people in existing departments to get involved?" His eagerness to pivot the conversation toward his own career prospects was so transparent that I almost smiled. Even in the face of evidence that his understanding of workplace dynamics was fundamentally flawed, David was already calculating how to position himself advantageously in the new organizational structure. "There will certainly be collaborative opportunities," I said diplomatically. "The Digital Innovation Division will work closely with all existing departments to integrate new technologies and processes. However, the specific nature of those collaborations will depend on each department's willingness to embrace change and their ability to adapt to new methodologies." It was a carefully neutral response that contained just enough ambiguity to make all of them slightly uncomfortable. They were beginning to understand that their relationship with me would no longer be defined by their perceived superiority or their casual dismissal of my contributions. I would be evaluating their departments, their performance, and their value to the company's future initiatives. The party continued around us, but our table had become an island of tense conversation in a sea of celebration. Other employees were networking, laughing, and enjoying the luxury of the venue, while we sat trapped in the awkward reality of a completely inverted power dynamic. Patricia Morgan appeared at our table, her presence immediately commanding attention from everyone in the vicinity. "Sarah, I hate to interrupt, but there are several board members who would like to meet you. Would you mind joining us for a few minutes?" It was phrased as a request, but we all understood it was really a summons to the kind of high-level conversation that defined executive-level networking. The kind of conversation that Marcus, Jennifer, and David had always assumed they would be invited to join as their careers progressed. I stood and smoothed my dress, suddenly very aware that every movement was being watched and analyzed by my former tablemates. "Of course, Patricia. I'd be honored." As I walked away from the table, following Patricia toward a group of distinguished-looking individuals near the bar, I could feel the weight of their stares on my back. For 3 years, they had been the ones networking with important people while I sat quietly in the background. Now I was being escorted to conversations they could only observe from a distance. The board members were exactly what I'd expected. Successful, confident people who were accustomed to making decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars. They greeted me with the kind of professional warmth that indicated they already knew who I was and were genuinely interested in what I had to say. "Sarah," Patricia said, "I'd like you to meet Jonathan Williams, our board chair, and Carol Rodriguez, who heads our finance committee." Jonathan extended his hand with a firm grip and a smile that reached his eyes. "Sarah, congratulations on your new position. Patricia has been telling us about your work for months, and we're excited to see what you'll accomplish." "Thank you, Mr. Williams. I'm looking forward to the challenges ahead." Carol stepped forward with her own warm greeting. "I've been reviewing the financial projections for the Digital Innovation Division, and I have to say, they're impressive. The revenue potential is substantial, but I'm equally interested in the cost savings you've projected through automation and efficiency improvements." For the next 20 minutes, I found myself in exactly the kind of conversation that Marcus, Jennifer, and David had always aspired to have. Strategic discussions about market positioning, detailed analysis of competitive advantages, and forward-thinking conversations about industry trends. The board members asked thoughtful questions about implementation timelines, staffing strategies, and risk management protocols. Throughout the conversation, I was acutely aware that my former table mates were watching from across the room. They could see me engaged in animated discussion with the company's most senior leadership, could observe the respectful attention I was receiving, could witness the kind of professional recognition they had assumed was reserved for people like themselves. When the conversation finally wound down, Jonathan handed me his business card. "Sarah, I want you to know that you have the full support of the board. If you need anything as you build out your division, please don't hesitate to reach out directly." Carol nodded in agreement. "We're confident that this initiative will be transformational for Meridian Technologies, and we're confident that you're the right person to lead it." As I made my way back across the room, I noticed that the dynamics of the party had shifted even further. People were approaching me more frequently, conversations were pausing as I passed nearby tables, and there was a general awareness that something significant had changed in the company's power structure. When I returned to our table, Marcus, Jennifer, and David were deep in conversation that stopped abruptly when they saw me approaching. Their expressions were a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, as if they were trying to decode what my conversation with the board members might mean for their own futures. "How did it go?" Jennifer asked, her voice carefully casual. "Very well. They're supportive of the new division and excited about the opportunities ahead." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Sarah, can I ask you something? When you were working on all of this with Patricia, developing these plans and securing these contracts, what was that like? I mean, how did you manage to do all of that while still handling your regular IT responsibilities?" It was a more perceptive question than I'd expected from him, and I realized he was beginning to understand the scope of what I'd accomplished. Managing two completely different professional identities for 6 months had required careful time management, strategic thinking, and a level of discretion that went far beyond simply keeping secrets. "It required a different approach to time management," I said carefully. "Most of the strategic work happened early in the morning, late in the evening, and on weekends. Patricia and I would meet before regular office hours, or after most people had gone home. The client meetings and contract negotiations were scheduled during lunch breaks or presented as routine IT consulting calls." David was shaking his head slowly. "I can't believe we never noticed. I mean, looking back, were there signs we should have picked up on?" "There were probably indicators if you'd been looking for them," I admitted. "I was occasionally unavailable during normal business hours for what I called external vendor meetings. I dressed slightly more professionally on certain days when I had important calls scheduled. I sometimes had access to information about company initiatives that hadn't been widely distributed yet." Jennifer was nodding, as if pieces were falling into place in her memory. "There were times when you seemed to know about strategic decisions before they were announced. I always assumed you'd heard something through IT channels or from Patricia's assistant." "Sometimes that was true," I said. "But sometimes I knew about those decisions because I'd been involved in making them." The conversation was interrupted by a server who approached our table with a bottle of champagne and 4 glasses. "Compliments of the board of directors," he said, setting the bottle down in the center of the table. They wanted to congratulate the new vice president and her colleagues. It was a generous gesture, but it also served to highlight the changed circumstances at our table. The champagne was specifically for me, acknowledging my new position, but it was being shared with people who were still trying to process the fact that their understanding of workplace hierarchy had been completely overturned. Marcus poured the champagne with hands that were steadier than they'd been an hour earlier, though I noticed he was being more careful than usual. The broken glass from his earlier shock had been cleaned up, but the memory of that moment lingered in his deliberate movements. "A toast," he said, raising his glass. "To Sarah, and to things not always being what they seem." It wasn't the most eloquent toast I'd ever heard, but it contained an acknowledgement that went beyond simple congratulations. Marcus was admitting that his perception of reality had been fundamentally incorrect, and that he was still struggling to adjust to the new information. We raised our glasses and drank, but the champagne tasted different than it would have an hour earlier. The power dynamics at the table had shifted so dramatically that even casual conversation felt loaded with subtext and unspoken implications. David set down his glass and looked directly at me. "Sarah, I have to ask, and please forgive me if this sounds inappropriate, but how do you feel about all of this? I mean, you've been sitting here listening to us give you career advice and talk about your limitations, and you knew the whole time that you were about to be promoted above all of us. How did you not? I don't know, how did you not say something?" It was perhaps the most honest question anyone had asked me all evening, and it deserved a thoughtful answer. Because anything I said would have sounded like bragging or fantasy. If I'd told you 6 months ago that I was being considered for a vice president position, would you have taken me seriously? Or would you have assumed I was delusional about my prospects? The silence that followed confirmed what we all knew. 6 months ago, if I'd mentioned being in consideration for executive leadership, they would have responded with gentle correction about the importance of being realistic, suggestions that I focus on advancing within technical support, and private conversations among themselves about my apparent inability to assess my own capabilities accurately. But beyond that, I continued, I needed to see how this company really operated when people thought no one important was watching. I needed to understand the actual culture, not the culture that gets presented in meetings or written in employee handbooks. Jennifer tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "What do you mean?" "I mean that for 6 months I've been observing how people treat colleagues they perceive as less important than themselves. I've been watching how decisions get made, how information flows through the organization, and how people behave when they think their actions don't have consequences." The implications of my statement settled over the table like a heavy blanket. I hadn't just been the quiet IT support specialist they'd ignored and condescended to. I'd been the future vice president, watching and evaluating their behavior, their professionalism, and their character. Marcus was the first to understand the full scope of what I was saying. "You were essentially conducting an undercover evaluation of the company culture." "Not intentionally at first," I said. "But as the months went on, yes, I realized that I was getting an unprecedented view of how people really behave when they think the person they're talking to doesn't matter." The champagne sat untouched in front of us as the weight of this revelation sank in. For 6 months, every casual dismissal, every condescending comment, every assumption about my limitations had been observed and remembered by someone who would soon have significant influence over their careers. "Sarah," Jennifer said quietly, "what happens now? I mean, with everything you've observed, everything you know about how we've treated you." It was the question they'd all been thinking, but had been afraid to ask directly. They were beginning to understand that the person they'd spent 3 years underestimating would soon be in a position to affect their professional futures, and they were worried about the potential consequences of their past behavior. I took a slow sip of champagne, letting the question hang in the air for a moment. When I finally responded, my voice was calm and measured. "What happens now is that I focus on building the digital innovation division and helping Meridian Technologies achieve its strategic goals. My evaluation of existing employees will be based on their contributions to those objectives, their ability to adapt to new technologies and processes, and their demonstrated commitment to collaborative professional behavior going forward." It was a diplomatic answer that contained both reassurance and warning. I wasn't going to use my new position for personal revenge, but I also wasn't going to pretend that the past 3 years hadn't happened. Their future opportunities would depend on their ability to rise to the standards that executive leadership expected, standards that some of them had never been required to meet before. The party was beginning to wind down around us, though small groups of people were still engaged in animated conversations throughout the venue. I noticed that several employees had approached Patricia to ask questions about the new division, and that there was a general sense of excitement about the opportunities the expansion would create. But at our table, the mood remained complex and uncomfortable. The celebration that should have accompanied such positive news for the company was overshadowed by the personal recalibrations that each of my table mates was struggling to navigate. As I finished my champagne and prepared to leave, Marcus made one final attempt at conversation. "Sarah, I want you to know that I've learned something important tonight. About assumptions, about respect, about a lot of things, actually." I stood and gathered my purse, looking around the table at 3 people who would never see me the same way again. "I hope so, Marcus. I really do." As I walked away from the table for the final time that evening, I knew that Monday morning would bring a completely different dynamic to the Meridian Technologies office. The woman who had spent 3 years being invisible was about to become one of the most visible and influential people in the building. And Marcus, Jennifer, and David would have to figure out how to work in a world where the person they'd consistently underestimated was now the person evaluating their performance, their potential, and their future with the company. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp Colorado sunshine that made everything look sharper, more defined. I sat in my Honda Civic in the parking garage, watching Marcus pull into his usual spot 3 spaces away in his leased BMW. He didn't notice me, too focused on checking his phone before heading into what he probably assumed would be another ordinary Monday at Meridian Technologies. If only he knew how extraordinary this Monday was going to be. I waited until he disappeared into the elevator before making my own way to the building. The security guard, Robert, greeted me with his usual friendly nod, completely unaware that the woman he'd been saying good morning to for 3 years was about to occupy an office on the executive floor. Some changes happen so gradually that people don't notice them until they're complete. Others happen overnight and leave everyone scrambling to understand the new reality. Instead of heading to the basement as I had every morning for the past 3 years, I pressed the button for the 15th floor. The elevator felt different when you were riding it with purpose instead of resignation, when you knew you belonged at the destination instead of simply accepting where you'd been assigned. The executive floor was quiet at 7:30 in the morning, populated only by Patricia's assistant, Linda, who greeted me with a knowing smile. She'd been scheduling my confidential meetings for months, and was one of the few people who hadn't been surprised by Friday night's announcement. "Good morning, Vice President Chen," she said, emphasizing the title with obvious pleasure. "Your office is ready, and your first apartment meeting is scheduled for 9 o'clock. My office. After 3 years in a basement room with fluorescent lighting and no windows, I now had a corner office with floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking downtown Denver and the Rocky Mountains beyond. The furniture was modern and substantial, the kind that conveyed authority without being ostentatious. My Stanford diploma and professional certifications, which had been gathering dust in my apartment, were now professionally framed and displayed on the wall behind my desk. But the most significant change wasn't the office itself. It was the stack of personnel files Linda had placed on my desk, representing the 12 people who would be reporting directly to me. Some were new hires who would be starting throughout the week, specialists in artificial intelligence and data analytics recruited from major tech companies. Others were existing Meridian employees who were being transferred into the new division based on their technical skills and growth potential. I opened the first file and smiled. Tom Bradley, maintenance supervisor, was being promoted to facilities operations manager for the digital innovation division. His practical problem-solving skills and genuine respect for all employees made him exactly the kind of leader I wanted on my team. Unlike some people, Tom had never needed a title change to treat others with dignity. The intercom on my desk buzzed softly. "Sarah, your 9 o'clock meeting participants are gathering in conference room A. Should I let them know you'll be there shortly?" "Thank you, Linda. I'll be right there." Conference room A was the largest meeting space on the executive floor, with a mahogany table that could seat 20 people and technology systems that allowed for seamless video conferencing with clients around the world. As I walked toward the room, I could hear voices through the partially open door, a mixture of excitement and nervous energy, that suggested people were still processing the magnitude of the changes happening at Meridian Technologies. I paused outside the door for a moment, listening to fragments of conversation from the people who would be working with me to build something unprecedented in the company's history. Did you see the size of the budget allocation? This is bigger than anything Meridian has ever attempted. The partnership agreements she negotiated are incredible. We're going to be working with some of the most innovative companies in the industry. I can't believe she was working in IT support while developing all of this. The strategic thinking required to pull this off. I stepped into the room, and the conversation stopped as 12 faces turned toward me. Some I recognized as existing employees. Others were new faces that belonged to the specialists who would be joining our team throughout the week. All of them looked at me with the kind of respectful attention that I'd been dreaming of for 3 years. Good morning, everyone. I know this is an unusual situation for all of us, so I thought we should start by addressing the obvious questions and then focusing on the work ahead. I moved to the head of the table, placing my tablet and a folder of documents in front of me. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. This wasn't a collaborative brainstorming session or a casual team-building exercise. This was a department meeting where I was clearly and unambiguously in charge. First, let me acknowledge that some of you are probably wondering how someone can go from IT support to vice president overnight. The answer is that it wasn't overnight. For the past 6 months, I've been working directly with Patricia Morgan to develop the strategic vision for this division, secure client contracts, establish technology partnerships, and recruit the team that's sitting in this room right now. I clicked open my tablet and projected the first slide of a presentation onto the large screen at the far end of the room. It showed a detailed organizational chart for the Digital Innovation Division, with clear reporting structures, project timelines, and budget allocations. What you're looking at represents the largest expansion in Meridian's history. We have confirmed contracts with 3 government agencies, preliminary agreements with 6 Fortune 500 companies, and partnership deals with major technology firms that will give us access to cutting-edge tools and platforms. The room was completely silent as people absorbed the scope of what we were building together. This wasn't a small pilot program or an experimental initiative. This was a fundamental transformation of how Meridian Technologies approached client services and market positioning. Over the next 6 months, we'll be implementing artificial intelligence solutions for clients who are dealing with complex data analysis challenges. We'll be developing predictive algorithms for government agencies who need to optimize resource allocation. We'll be creating automated systems that will save our corporate clients millions of dollars in operational efficiency. I advanced to the next slide, which showed projected revenue figures that exceeded the company's current annual earnings. The financial projections are conservative. Based on the contracts we've already secured and the pipeline we're developing, this division will become the primary revenue driver for Meridian Technologies within 18 months. Tom Bradley raised his hand slightly, and I nodded for him to speak. Sarah, this is incredible, but I have to ask about the practical implementation. How do we manage projects of this scale while maintaining the quality standards that our existing clients expect? It was exactly the kind of thoughtful, operational question I'd been hoping for. Tom understood that ambitious plans meant nothing without careful execution and attention to detail. That's an excellent question, Tom, and it gets to the heart of why this team was assembled the way it was. Each person in this room brings specific expertise that addresses different aspects of project management, technical implementation, and client relations. I spent the next hour walking through detailed project plans, implementation timelines, and quality control protocols. The people around the table asked intelligent questions, offered valuable insights, and demonstrated exactly why they'd been selected for this initiative. It was the kind of substantive, strategic conversation that I'd been craving for 3 years, while sitting in meetings where my input was neither requested nor valued. As the meeting concluded, I noticed that the energy in the room had shifted from nervous uncertainty to genuine excitement. People were beginning to understand not just what we were building, but how they would contribute to something that could reshape their careers and the company's future. Our next full team meeting will be Wednesday at 9, once the remaining team members have started. Between now and then, please review the project documentation I'm sending to each of you, and come prepared with questions or suggestions for optimization. As people filed out of the conference room, chatting among themselves about specific projects and technical challenges, I realized that I'd just experienced something I'd never had at Meridian Technologies before. I'd led a meeting where people listened to me because they respected my expertise, not because they were required to attend. I'd presented strategic information that people valued because they understood its importance, not because they were politely tolerating my presence. The contrast with every other meeting I'd attended at this company was stark and deeply satisfying. I was gathering my materials when Linda appeared in the doorway. "Sarah, I have Marcus Rodriguez on line 2. He's asking if he can schedule a meeting with you sometime this week." The request wasn't entirely unexpected, but the timing was interesting. Marcus had waited until Monday morning, after the weekend had given him time to process Friday's announcement and consider its implications for his own position at the company. "Tell him I can see him at 2 o'clock this afternoon. 15 minutes should be sufficient." Linda nodded and disappeared to relay the message. I spent the next few hours reviewing personnel files, responding to emails from new clients, and familiarizing myself with the technology systems that would support our project management processes. It was the kind of engaging, intellectually challenging work that made me lose track of time, the opposite of the repetitive technical support tasks that had been slowly draining my enthusiasm for the past 3 years. At exactly 2 o'clock, Marcus knocked on my office door. I looked up from my computer to see him standing in the doorway, his usual confidence notably absent. He was holding a legal pad and wearing the kind of carefully professional expression that people adopt when they're not sure how to navigate an uncomfortable conversation. "Come in, Marcus. Please, have a seat." He settled into one of the chairs facing my desk, his eyes taking in the transformation of my professional environment. The corner office, the mountain views, the framed credentials on the wall, the stack of important-looking documents spread across my desk. All of it served as physical evidence that his understanding of workplace hierarchy had been fundamentally incorrect. "Sarah, thank you for making time to see me. I know you must be incredibly busy with everything that's happening." I leaned back in my chair, adopting the kind of relaxed but attentive posture that conveyed both openness and control. "What can I do for you, Marcus?" He consulted his legal pad, though I suspected the notes were more for emotional support than actual reference. "I wanted to discuss the integration opportunities between the Digital Innovation Division and the Marketing Department. I think there could be some really valuable synergies, especially around client communications and project promotion." It was a reasonable opening, the kind of professional collaboration request that made sense in the context of a major organizational expansion. But I could hear the subtext in his voice, the careful way he was presenting himself as someone who could add value to my initiatives, rather than someone who might be threatened by the changes happening around him. "That's an interesting suggestion," I said. "What specific capabilities do you think your department could contribute to our client projects?" Marcus brightened slightly, encouraged by my willingness to engage with his proposal. "Well, we have extensive experience with corporate communications, brand positioning, and stakeholder management. Those skills could be really valuable as you're working with Fortune 500 clients and government agencies." I nodded thoughtfully, making notes on my tablet as he spoke. Marcus was right that his department had relevant expertise, but he was also revealing how little he understood about the nature of the work we'd be doing. The clients I'd been meeting with for the past 6 months weren't interested in traditional marketing approaches. They wanted technical solutions, measurable results, and consultants who could speak their language about complex analytical challenges. "Those are certainly important capabilities," I said diplomatically. "However, I should clarify that most of our client relationships will be focused on technical implementation rather than traditional marketing support. The government agencies we're working with have very specific requirements for vendor communications, and the corporate clients are primarily interested in quantifiable operational improvements." I could see Marcus processing this information, recalibrating his understanding of what the Digital Innovation Division actually did and how it might intersect with his own area of expertise. "Of course," he said quickly, "I understand that the technical aspects are the primary focus, but even technical projects need effective communication strategies, progress reports, and stakeholder updates. That's where I think my team could really add value." It was a more thoughtful response than I'd expected, and it suggested that Marcus was genuinely trying to identify ways to contribute, rather than simply positioning himself for advancement opportunities. You raise a valid point about communication requirements, I acknowledged. However, I should mention that most of our major clients have been very specific about wanting direct communication with the technical teams, rather than filtered through marketing intermediaries. They want to interact with the people who understand the systems they're implementing. The statement was true, but it also served to establish a clear boundary about how client relationships would be managed within my division. Marcus was beginning to understand that the traditional corporate hierarchy, where marketing departments often controlled client communications, wouldn't necessarily apply to the work we were doing. I see, he said, his enthusiasm dimming slightly. Well, perhaps there are other ways we could collaborate. Internal communications, employee engagement around the new initiatives, coordination with existing clients who might be interested in expanded services. I appreciated that he was persistent without being pushy, that he was adapting his proposals based on the feedback I was providing. But I also noticed that every suggestion he made was focused on finding ways for his department to become involved in my division's work, rather than considering how the digital innovation division might support marketing initiatives. Marcus, can I ask you something directly? What are you hoping to accomplish with this collaboration? The question caught him off guard, and I watched his carefully prepared professional demeanor slip slightly. For a moment, he looked less like a confident project manager, and more like someone who was genuinely concerned about his future at the company. Honestly, Sarah, I'm trying to understand how the changes you're implementing will affect the rest of us. The digital innovation division is going to be huge, and I want to make sure my team stays relevant and continues to add value to the company. It was a more honest answer than I'd expected, and it revealed the real motivation behind his meeting request. Marcus wasn't primarily interested in collaboration. He was worried about being marginalized by the expansion of my division, about losing influence and opportunities as the company's strategic focus shifted toward technical innovation. I appreciate your honesty, I said, and I understand your concerns. Major organizational changes always create uncertainty about how existing roles and departments will evolve. I leaned forward slightly, adopting a more collaborative posture. The truth is, Marcus, that there will definitely be opportunities for the marketing department to support digital innovation initiatives. But those opportunities will be based on your team's ability to understand and effectively communicate complex technical concepts, not on traditional marketing approaches. Marcus was taking notes now, his pen moving quickly across the legal pad. What would that look like in practice? It would mean developing expertise in artificial intelligence applications, learning to create documentation for government compliance requirements, and understanding how to present technical solutions to C-level executives who are focused on operational efficiency rather than brand positioning. I could see him processing this information, weighing the effort required to develop new capabilities against the potential benefits of being involved in the company's most important growth initiative. That's definitely something we could work toward, he said carefully. It would require some additional training and skill development, but my team is adaptable and eager to take on new challenges. It was the kind of response that sounded positive but contained enough hedge language to avoid any firm commitments. Marcus was interested in the opportunities, but he wasn't ready to commit to the substantial effort that would be required to genuinely contribute to technical projects. I'm glad to hear that, I said. Why don't you put together a proposal outlining how your department could develop the capabilities I mentioned? Include specific training plans, timeline for skill development, and examples of how you envision supporting our client projects. We can review it in a few weeks and see if there are viable collaboration opportunities. It was a diplomatic way of giving Marcus something constructive to work on while avoiding any immediate commitments about future collaboration. If he was serious about adapting his department's capabilities, the proposal would demonstrate that commitment. If he was simply trying to position himself advantageously without doing the necessary work, the exercise would reveal that as well. Marcus looked relieved to have a concrete action item, something he could point to as progress from our meeting. That sounds great, Sarah. I'll get started on that right away and have something for you to review by the end of next week. As he stood to leave, I noticed that his posture had changed throughout our conversation. He'd entered the office with the kind of casual confidence that had characterized our interactions for the past 3 years, but he was leaving with a more careful, respectful demeanor that acknowledged the shift in our professional relationship. Marcus, I said as he reached the door. I want you to know that I'm not interested in creating adversarial relationships between departments. The success of the Digital Innovation Division depends on effective collaboration with all areas of the company. But that collaboration has to be based on genuine value creation, not just political positioning. He nodded seriously. I understand, Sarah. And I want you to know that I'm committed to earning a place in whatever collaborative opportunities develop. After Marcus left, I spent a few minutes reflecting on the conversation and what it revealed about the broader dynamics that were shifting throughout the company. People were beginning to understand that the Digital Innovation Division wasn't just another department that would coexist with existing operations. It was a fundamental change in how Meridian Technologies approached client services, and it would inevitably affect everyone's role and influence within the organization. Some people, like Tom Bradley, would thrive in the new environment because they'd always focused on substance over politics, on results over positioning. Others, like Marcus, would need to adapt their approach and develop new capabilities if they wanted to remain relevant. And still others would probably struggle to find their place in a company that was increasingly focused on technical innovation and measurable results. The intercom buzzed again. Sarah, Jennifer Walsh is here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it will only take a few minutes. I checked my calendar and realized I had 20 minutes before my next scheduled meeting. Send her in. Jennifer appeared in my doorway moments later, looking less polished than usual. Her normally perfect hair was slightly disheveled, and she was clutching a folder with white-knuckled intensity that suggested significant stress. Sarah, I'm sorry to drop by without an appointment. I know you must be incredibly busy, but I was hoping we could talk for just a few minutes. Unlike Marcus, who had approached our conversation with careful preparation and strategic thinking, Jennifer seemed genuinely distraught. Her usual confident demeanor was nowhere to be seen, replaced by an anxiety that made her seem younger and more vulnerable than I'd ever observed. Of course, Jennifer. Please, sit down. What's on your mind? She settled into the same chair Marcus had occupied, but where he had been calculating and political, she was clearly emotional. Her hands were shaking slightly as she opened the folder and pulled out what appeared to be a printout of an email. Sarah, I received this message this morning from my supervisor, and I'm not sure what to make of it. It says that all marketing activities related to client acquisition and retention are being suspended pending a strategic review of departmental priorities. She handed me the email, her voice growing smaller as she continued. It also says that our budget for the next quarter has been frozen and that we need to prepare detailed justifications for all current projects and personnel allocations. I read through the email carefully, recognizing the language and approach as consistent with how Patricia Morgan typically managed organizational transitions. It wasn't unusual for her to pause non-essential activities when major changes were being implemented, especially when those changes might affect how departments coordinated their efforts. Jennifer, this sounds like standard protocol for when new divisions are being established. Patricia wants to make sure that all departmental activities are aligned with the company's updated strategic priorities. Jennifer's eyes were bright with unshed tears, and I realized that what seemed like routine administrative process to me felt like an existential threat to her. But Sarah, what if our department isn't aligned with the new priorities? What if the work we've been doing isn't considered valuable anymore? What if they decide that marketing isn't necessary when the clients are coming directly through your division? Her questions revealed the depth of her anxiety about the changes happening at Meridian Technologies. Jennifer had built her career on traditional marketing approaches, developing expertise in areas that might indeed become less relevant as the company shifted toward technical consulting services. Jennifer, can I ask you something? When you think about the work your department does, what do you consider your core value proposition to the company? She looked confused by the question, as if she'd never been asked to articulate the fundamental purpose of her role in such direct terms. We manage the company's brand image, develop marketing materials, coordinate trade show participation, and support client relationship management, she said, reciting what sounded like a job description rather than a strategic analysis. Those are activities, I said gently. But what outcomes do those activities produce? What problems do they solve for Meridian Technologies? Jennifer stared at me for a long moment, clearly struggling to reframe her work in terms of measurable business results rather than task completion. "We help the company maintain visibility in the market," she said slowly. "We create materials that support the sales process. We coordinate events that generate leads and networking opportunities." It was a more thoughtful answer, but it also revealed why she was so worried about the strategic review. Most of the outcomes she described were becoming less relevant as Meridian transitioned toward client relationships that were based on technical expertise, rather than traditional sales and marketing approaches. "Jennifer, those are important capabilities, but I think you're underestimating your potential to contribute in other ways. You have strong project management skills, excellent attention to detail, and experience coordinating complex events and communications." I could see her processing this feedback, trying to understand how her existing skills might translate to the new environment we were creating. "The question is whether you're interested in developing expertise in areas that would be more directly relevant to technical consulting services. That might mean learning about artificial intelligence applications, understanding government contracting requirements, or developing skills in data visualization and technical documentation." Jennifer's expression shifted from anxiety to something that looked like cautious hope. "You think there might be opportunities for me to work with the Digital Innovation Division?" "I think there might be opportunities for you to evolve your role in ways that support the company's new strategic direction," I said carefully. "But that would require significant effort to develop new capabilities and a willingness to approach your work very differently than you have in the past." Jennifer was nodding eagerly now, her earlier distress replaced by focused attention. "I would be willing to do that. I want to do that. I just need to understand what specifically I should be learning and how to get started." It was a much more positive response than I'd expected, and it suggested that Jennifer might be more adaptable than her initial panic had indicated. Unlike Marcus, who had approached our conversation with political calculation, Jennifer seemed genuinely motivated to contribute, rather than simply to protect her position. "The first step would be to understand what the Digital Innovation Division actually does," I said. "I'm sending you access to our project documentation and client profiles. Spend some time reviewing that material and then come back to me with specific ideas about how your skills could support our initiatives." I made a note on my tablet to have Linda provide Jennifer with appropriate access to our internal systems. "But Jennifer, I want to be clear about something. This isn't about finding a way to fit marketing into technical projects. This is about determining whether you can develop the capabilities to genuinely contribute to technical projects." Jennifer nodded seriously. "I understand the difference, and I appreciate you being direct about the expectations. I'd rather know what I'm working toward than have false hope about opportunities that don't really exist." As Jennifer left my office, I realized that the conversation had revealed something important about how different people were responding to the changes at Meridian Technologies. Marcus had approached the situation politically, looking for ways to position his department advantageously within the new structure. Jennifer had approached it more personally, focusing on her own ability to adapt and contribute. Both approaches were understandable, but only one of them was likely to result in genuine success in the environment we were building. The Digital Innovation Division would succeed based on results, not politics, and the people who thrived would be those who focused on developing real capabilities rather than managing perceptions. My phone buzzed with a text message from David Kim. "Hey Sarah, congrats again on the promotion. Any chance we could grab coffee this week? Would love to hear more about the new division and potential opportunities for collaboration." I stared at the message for a moment, noting the casual tone and the assumption that I would be interested in an informal coffee meeting to discuss potential opportunities. David was approaching the situation with the same kind of networking mentality that had served him well in sales, but which was completely inappropriate for the professional relationship we now had. I typed back a brief response. "Thanks, David. If you're interested in potential collaboration between your department and the Digital Innovation Division, please coordinate with Linda to schedule a formal meeting. She can provide you with our standard requirements for partnership proposals." The response was polite but clear about the boundaries of our professional interaction. David was no longer a colleague who could casually drop by for coffee. He was a representative of another department who would need to follow proper channels if he wanted to discuss business opportunities. The rest of the afternoon passed quickly as I reviewed project timelines, responded to client communications, and prepared for Tuesday's meetings with our new government contractors. It was the kind of engaging, strategic work that made me understand why I'd been willing to spend 6 months living a double life to get to this position. As 5:30 approached, I noticed that the usual post-work social dynamic was playing out in the hallway outside my office. Marcus, Jennifer, and David were standing near the elevator, probably coordinating their evening plans and processing the day's developments. In the past, their conversations would have been invisible to me, taking place in a social sphere that I wasn't invited to join. Now their conversations were taking place outside the office of someone who would be evaluating their departments, their performance, and their future opportunities at Meridian Technologies. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that they were the ones who were now invisible to me, discussing their concerns and strategies in a space where I could observe them, but choose not to engage. I gathered my materials and prepared to leave for the day, looking forward to returning to my apartment and reflecting on everything that had changed in the span of 72 hours. But as I reached the elevator, I heard David call my name. "Sarah," perfect timing. "We were just talking about grabbing drinks at that new place in LoDo. You should join us." It was exactly the kind of invitation that I'd been excluded from for 3 years, the casual social inclusion that had always been reserved for people they considered their equals. But now it felt different, less like genuine friendship and more like strategic relationship management. "Thanks for the invitation," I said as the elevator doors opened, "but I have other plans tonight." As the doors closed and the elevator began its descent, I realized that I no longer needed their social approval or professional recognition. I had something much more valuable: the respect that comes from achievement, the authority that comes from expertise, and the satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful rather than simply occupying space. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new dynamics, as the Digital Innovation Division continued to take shape. But tonight I was content to go home to my modest apartment, pour a glass of wine, and appreciate how much can change when someone finally gets the chance to show what they're truly capable of accomplishing. 3 months later, I stood in the same conference room where I'd first addressed my team. But everything had transformed beyond recognition. The mahogany table was now surrounded by 24 people instead of 12, representing the rapid expansion of the Digital Innovation Division. The wall-mounted screens displayed real-time project dashboards showing client satisfaction scores, revenue metrics, and implementation timelines that exceeded every projection we'd made during those early planning sessions. The government contracts had not only been fulfilled ahead of schedule, but had generated referrals to additional agencies. The Fortune 500 partnerships had evolved into long-term strategic relationships that were reshaping how major corporations approached data analytics and automation. The satellite offices in San Francisco and Austin were already profitable and expanding their local client bases faster than we'd anticipated. But the most significant change wasn't visible in the revenue reports or organizational charts. It was the fundamental shift in how people interacted with me throughout the building. How conversations stopped when I entered a room, not from discomfort but from respect. How my opinions were sought on strategic decisions that went far beyond the Digital Innovation Division. The quarterly review results just came in from our largest government client, announced Rachel Martinez, our newly promoted Director of Client Relations. They're requesting a contract extension through 2027 and want to discuss expanding our services to 3 additional departments. The room erupted in spontaneous applause, but I noticed that Rachel barely paused to acknowledge the celebration before continuing with her presentation. That was the culture we'd built together over these months. One where success was expected rather than surprising, where excellence was the baseline rather than the exception. The predictive analytics system we implemented has already saved them $12 million in operational costs, and they're projecting additional savings of $30 million over the next 2 years. More importantly, they want us to train their internal teams on advanced implementation techniques, which opens up an entirely new revenue stream for ongoing consulting services. I watched the faces around the table as Rachel outlined the expansion opportunities, noting the focused attention and strategic thinking that had become characteristic of our team meetings. These weren't people who were satisfied with completing assigned tasks. They were professionals who understood that their individual contributions were building something extraordinary, and they took personal ownership of our collective success. Tom Bradley raised his hand to ask about the infrastructure requirements for the expanded services, and I felt a familiar sense of satisfaction watching him navigate complex technical discussions with the same practical wisdom he'd always brought to facilities management. His promotion from maintenance supervisor to facilities operations manager had been one of my most rewarding decisions, proving that intelligence and leadership potential often existed in places where traditional corporate hierarchies never thought to look. The infrastructure scaling will require additional server capacity and enhanced security protocols, Tom said, consulting the tablet that had replaced his paper clipboard months ago. I've been working with our IT partnerships to design systems that can handle the increased data processing requirements while maintaining the compliance standards that government clients require. It was exactly the kind of proactive problem-solving that had made Tom invaluable to our operations, and it represented the broader transformation that had occurred throughout the division. People weren't waiting for problems to emerge before developing solutions. They were anticipating challenges and creating systems that could adapt to changing requirements without compromising quality or efficiency. The meeting continued for another hour, covering client feedback, technical innovations, and strategic planning for the next quarter. When we finally concluded, people lingered in small groups discussing implementation details and sharing insights about their specific projects. The energy in the room was infectious, the kind of engaged enthusiasm that occurs when people genuinely believe in the importance of their work. As the conference room emptied, I remained behind to review my notes and prepare for the afternoon's activities. That's when Linda appeared in the doorway with an expression that suggested she had news that was either very good or potentially concerning. Sarah, I just received a call from Patricia Morgan's office. The board of directors has scheduled an emergency meeting for this afternoon, and they've specifically requested your attendance. Apparently there's been some kind of development with one of our major clients that requires immediate strategic discussion. Emergency board meetings were rare at Meridian Technologies, typically reserved for crisis management or extraordinary opportunities that required rapid decision-making at the highest levels of the organization. Given the success we'd been experiencing with client relationships, I was cautiously optimistic that this was the latter rather than the former. Do we know which client is involved or what kind of development they're referring to? Linda shook her head. Patricia's assistant was deliberately vague, but she did mention that the meeting involves discussions about potential acquisition opportunities and strategic partnerships that could significantly expand our market position. Acquisition opportunities. That phrase immediately caught my attention because it suggested something far beyond the normal scope of client services or contract negotiations. In the 3 months since launching the Digital Innovation Division, we've received informal inquiries from several larger consulting firms about potential partnerships, but nothing that had progressed to serious discussions. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing all of our major client relationships, looking for any indicators of unusual activity or strategic developments that might have prompted an emergency board meeting. The government contracts were performing exceptionally well, the Fortune 500 partnerships were exceeding expectations, and our technology partnerships were generating innovation opportunities that we hadn't even fully explored yet. At 3 o'clock, I made my way to the boardroom on the 16th floor, a space I'd only visited once before during my initial interview process with Patricia. The room was impressive in its understated elegance, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Denver and a conference table that could accommodate 30 people. Today, however, only 8 individuals were present, representing the core decision-makers who guided Meridian Technologies' strategic direction. Patricia Morgan sat at the head of the table, flanked by Jonathan Williams and Carol Rodriguez, the board members I'd met at the holiday party. The other 5 individuals were faces I recognized from executive leadership meetings but had never interacted with directly. All of them turned toward me as I entered the room, their expressions serious but not alarmed. Sarah, thank you for joining us on short notice, Patricia said, gesturing toward an empty chair positioned directly across from her. We've received a proposal that has significant implications for both the Digital Innovation Division and Meridian Technologies as a whole, and we need your input on how to proceed. I settled into the indicated chair, placing my tablet and notebook on the polished surface in front of me. The formality of the setting and the careful way Patricia had phrased her introduction suggested that whatever proposal they'd received was substantial enough to potentially reshape the company's future direction. Jonathan Williams leaned forward, his expression thoughtful and engaged. Sarah, we've been contacted by Apex Strategic Solutions, one of the largest consulting firms on the West Coast. They're interested in acquiring the Digital Innovation Division, along with all current contracts, client relationships, and personnel. The statement hit me like a physical impact, despite the calm, professional manner in which it had been delivered. Apex Strategic Solutions was indeed a major player in the consulting industry, with annual revenues exceeding $2 billion and client relationships that included some of the most powerful corporations and government agencies in the country. They've made a preliminary offer of $400 million for the division, Carol Rodriguez added, her voice equally measured and professional. The proposal includes guaranteed employment for all current personnel, performance bonuses for key leadership, and continued autonomy for division operations under the Apex organizational structure. $400 million. The number was so far beyond anything I'd imagined when we first started building the Digital Innovation Division that I struggled to process its implications. In less than a year, we'd created something valuable enough to attract acquisition interest from industry giants, something that represented nearly double Meridian Technologies' current market valuation. I understand this comes as a surprise, Patricia said, studying my expression carefully. But we need to consider all strategic options, especially when they involve opportunities of this magnitude. The question is whether this acquisition would serve the best interests of the division, the company, and the people who've built something extraordinary over the past few months. I took a moment to collect my thoughts, understanding that my response to this proposal would be one of the most important professional conversations of my career. The board was clearly taking the offer seriously, but they were also seeking my input on whether the acquisition aligned with our long-term strategic objectives. Before I can provide meaningful input on this proposal, I said carefully, I'd like to understand Apex's motivation for the acquisition and their plans for integrating our operations with their existing services. Jonathan nodded approvingly. Excellent question. According to their representatives, Apex has been struggling to develop competitive capabilities in artificial intelligence and advanced data analytics. They see our division as a way to immediately establish market leadership in those areas without the time and resource investment required to build those capabilities internally. It was a logical motivation, and it suggested that Apex recognized the true value of what we'd accomplished at Meridian Technologies. But it also raised questions about whether they understood the cultural and operational factors that had made our success possible. Have they provided details about how they would maintain the client relationships we've developed? I asked. Our government contracts and Fortune 500 partnerships are based on specific expertise and established trust relationships that might not transfer seamlessly to a larger organizational structure. Carol consulted the documents spread in front of her. They've proposed maintaining all current client relationships under the existing contract terms, with the understanding that key personnel would remain in their current roles for a minimum of 3 years. They're also offering significant retention bonuses to ensure continuity of leadership during the transition period. The financial terms were certainly attractive, but they didn't address the more fundamental question of whether our division's culture and approach to client services would survive integration into a much larger corporate environment. The success we'd achieved had been built on agility, direct communication, and the ability to make rapid decisions without navigating complex bureaucratic processes. What's the timeline for making a decision on this proposal? I asked. Patricia glanced around the table before responding. Apex has requested a preliminary response within 2 weeks, with final negotiations to be completed within 60 days if we decide to proceed. They're apparently considering similar acquisition opportunities with other firms, so they want to move quickly on their preferred option. The urgency of the timeline suggested that Apex was serious about expanding their capabilities in our areas of expertise, but it also meant that any decision would need to be made based on limited information about their long-term strategic intentions. I'd like to request a meeting with Apex leadership before providing my recommendation, I said. Specifically, I want to understand their vision for how the Digital Innovation Division would operate within their organizational structure, their plans for continued investment in research and development, and their approach to maintaining the client relationships that represent our primary value proposition. The board members exchanged glances, clearly impressed by the strategic nature of my response. I wasn't rejecting the proposal outright, but I also wasn't accepting it without thorough due diligence about its implications for the people and projects I'd been responsible for building. That seems like a reasonable approach, Jonathan agreed. We'll arrange for you to meet with their executive team next week, along with Patricia and myself. That should give us the information we need to make an informed decision about whether this acquisition serves our long-term interests. As the meeting concluded and board members began filing out of the room, Patricia asked me to remain behind for a private conversation. When we were alone, she moved to the chair next to mine, adopting a more informal posture that suggested she wanted to discuss the proposal in personal as well as professional terms. Sarah, I want you to know that whatever decision we make about this acquisition, it will be based primarily on your assessment of whether it's the right strategic move for the division you've built. The board recognizes that you understand the operational realities and client relationships better than anyone else in the company. Her statement was both reassuring and sobering, highlighting the responsibility I now carried for decisions that would affect not only my own career but the futures of 24 people who had trusted me to build something meaningful and sustainable. I appreciate that confidence, I said. But I also want to make sure that whatever decision we make serves the best interests of Meridian Technologies as a whole, not just the digital innovation division. Patricia smiled, the kind of expression that conveyed both professional respect and personal pride. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking that convinced me you were the right person to lead this initiative. You've never lost sight of the bigger picture, even as you've been building something extraordinary within your specific area of responsibility. Over the next week, I found myself navigating a complex web of conversations, meetings, and strategic analysis as we prepared for the discussions with Apex Strategic Solutions. The potential acquisition had created a buzz of speculation throughout the company, with people wondering whether the deal would result in expanded opportunities or fundamental changes to the organizational culture they'd grown accustomed to. My team members were understandably concerned about how an acquisition might affect their roles, their projects, and their career trajectories. During our regular team meetings, I tried to provide as much information as possible, while acknowledging that many details remained uncertain until we had more substantive discussions with Apex leadership. The most important thing to understand, I told them during our Wednesday morning meeting, is that any decision we make will be based on whether the acquisition enhances our ability to serve clients effectively and continue building innovative solutions to complex problems. We're not interested in deals that prioritize short-term financial gains over long-term strategic success. Tom Bradley raised his hand with a question that I knew was on everyone's mind. Sarah, if this acquisition goes through, what happens to the culture we've built here? Will we still have the autonomy to make rapid decisions and implement creative solutions? Or will we be constrained by corporate bureaucracy? It was exactly the right question, and it highlighted why Tom had become such an invaluable member of our leadership team. He understood that our success had been built on more than just technical expertise or client relationships. It had been built on an organizational culture that valued results over politics, innovation over tradition, and collaborative problem-solving over hierarchical decision-making. That's one of the key issues we'll be exploring in our meetings with Apex, I said. We need to understand not just their financial offer, but their vision for how we would operate within their organizational structure. If they can't provide convincing assurances that our culture and operational approach will be preserved, then the acquisition doesn't make strategic sense, regardless of the financial terms. The meeting with Apex leadership was scheduled for the following Monday at their headquarters in San Francisco. Patricia, Jonathan, and I would be traveling together to present our questions and evaluate their responses. In preparation for those discussions, I spent the weekend reviewing everything I could find about Apex's organizational structure, client relationships, and recent strategic initiatives. What I discovered was both impressive and concerning. Apex had certainly achieved remarkable growth over the past decade, expanding from a regional consulting firm to a national powerhouse with offices in 12 major cities. Their client list included Fortune 100 corporations, federal agencies, and international organizations that represented the most prestigious opportunities in the consulting industry. However, their growth had come primarily through acquisitions of smaller firms, and their track record for maintaining the innovative cultures of acquired companies was mixed at best. Several former executives from acquired firms had left Apex within 2 years of their acquisitions, citing bureaucratic constraints and loss of operational autonomy as primary factors in their departures. The flight to San Francisco gave Patricia, Jonathan, and me an opportunity to discuss our strategy for the meetings and establish clear criteria for evaluating Apex's proposal. We agreed that financial terms, while important, would be secondary to operational considerations and cultural compatibility. The question isn't whether they can afford to acquire us, Patricia said as we reviewed our notes during the flight. The question is whether they understand what made us valuable enough to acquire in the first place, and whether they can preserve those qualities within their organizational structure. Apex's headquarters occupied 4 floors of a gleaming office tower in the financial district, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular views of San Francisco Bay. The reception area was impressive in its scale and sophistication, clearly designed to convey success and institutional permanence to visiting clients and potential partners. We were escorted to a conference room on the 32nd floor, where 5 Apex executives were waiting to present their vision for the acquisition. The lead representative was Victoria Chen, the Executive Vice President for Strategic Development, who had built her career managing complex acquisitions and integration processes. "Thank you for making the trip to San Francisco," Victoria said as we settled around the conference table. "We're genuinely excited about the possibility of bringing the Digital Innovation Division into the Apex family, and we want to make sure you have all the information you need to make an informed decision about this opportunity." For the next 2 hours, the Apex team presented detailed plans for how they would integrate our operations with their existing services, maintain our client relationships, and preserve the operational autonomy that had made our success possible. Their presentation was thorough, professional, and carefully designed to address the concerns we'd outlined in our preliminary discussions. But as the presentation continued, I began to notice subtle indications that their understanding of our value proposition was more superficial than they were acknowledging. They spoke about leveraging synergies and optimizing resource allocation in ways that suggested they viewed our division primarily as a collection of contracts and technical capabilities, rather than a cohesive team with a distinctive approach to client services. When they finished their presentation, Victoria turned to me with a smile that seemed both confident and slightly patronizing. "Sarah, we understand that you've built something remarkable at Meridian Technologies, and we want to assure you that Apex is committed to preserving everything that made the Digital Innovation Division successful. What questions can we answer to help you feel comfortable with this transition?" The phrasing of her question was telling. She was assuming that the acquisition was a foregone conclusion, and that my role was simply to be reassured about the transition process. It was exactly the kind of assumption that successful people sometimes make when they're accustomed to getting what they want through financial leverage, rather than strategic persuasion. "I appreciate the comprehensive presentation," I said carefully, "but I have some specific questions about how our operational approach would be maintained within Apex's organizational structure." I spent the next 30 minutes asking detailed questions about decision-making processes, client communication protocols, and project management systems. Their responses were diplomatic, but revealed fundamental differences in how they approached client relationships and service delivery. Where we had built our success on direct communication between technical experts and client decision-makers, Apex preferred layered account management structures that filtered client interactions through multiple organizational levels. Where we had maintained rapid response times and flexible project timelines, Apex emphasized standardized processes and predictable delivery schedules. Neither approach was inherently superior, but they represented fundamentally different philosophies about how consulting services should be delivered. The question was whether those differences could be reconciled in ways that preserved the qualities that had made our division attractive to Apex in the first place. As the meeting concluded, Victoria handed me a leather portfolio containing detailed financial projections and integration timelines. "Sarah, I want you to know that Apex recognizes your leadership as one of the primary assets we'd be acquiring. We're prepared to offer you a substantial retention package and a leadership role that would give you influence over our entire artificial intelligence and data analytics practice." It was a generous offer, both financially and professionally, but it was also a clear indication that Apex viewed the acquisition primarily as an opportunity to acquire talent and capabilities, rather than to preserve a distinctive organizational culture. The flight back to Denver gave us time to debrief the meetings and compare our impressions of Apex's proposal. Patricia and Jonathan had been equally impressed by the financial terms, and equally concerned about the cultural compatibility issues we'd identified. The offer is certainly attractive, Jonathan said, reviewing the financial projections Apex had provided. But I'm not convinced that they understand what made the Digital Innovation Division successful in the first place. They seem to think they can transplant our capabilities into their organizational structure without considering whether that structure is compatible with our approach to client services. Patricia nodded in agreement. My concern is that we'd be selling something that would cease to exist within 6 months of the acquisition. If they can't preserve the qualities that made us valuable, then we're essentially selling them the illusion of capabilities they won't actually be able to deliver. Over the next week, I found myself in countless conversations with team members, clients, and other stakeholders as word of the potential acquisition spread throughout our professional network. The feedback was consistently mixed, with people expressing excitement about the financial opportunities while voicing concerns about potential changes to our operational approach. The most telling conversation came from one of our major government clients, who called to express concern about rumors of the acquisition. Sarah, we've been incredibly satisfied with the services the Digital Innovation Division has provided, but our positive experience has been based on your team's ability to respond quickly to changing requirements and communicate directly with our technical staff. If that changes, we'll need to reconsider our contract renewals. Similar concerns were raised by our Fortune 500 clients, who valued our flexibility and responsiveness above the institutional credibility that a larger firm might provide. It became clear that the client relationships Apex was hoping to acquire might not survive the integration process they were proposing. After extensive discussions with the board, our team, and our clients, I reached a conclusion about the Apex proposal. While the financial terms were attractive, the acquisition would fundamentally alter the qualities that had made our success possible. We would be trading our operational autonomy and cultural distinctiveness for institutional scale and financial resources. But the trade-off would ultimately serve neither our clients' interests nor our own long-term strategic objectives. When I presented my recommendation to the board the following Monday, I argued that Meridian Technologies would be better served by continuing to build the Digital Innovation Division organically, rather than selling it to an organization that couldn't preserve its essential characteristics. The success we've achieved over the past year has been built on specific cultural and operational factors that wouldn't survive integration into Apex's organizational structure, I explained. While their offer is financially attractive, accepting it would essentially mean destroying the thing they want to acquire. The board voted unanimously to decline Apex's proposal, a decision that was met with relief from our team members and approval from our clients. But the acquisition discussions had also highlighted the extraordinary value we'd created in a remarkably short period of time, and they had clarified our strategic priorities for continued growth. 6 months later, as I stood in our newly expanded conference room addressing a team that had grown to 43 people, I reflected on how much had changed since that December evening when Patricia Morgan had first announced my promotion. The Digital Innovation Division had not only met every projection we'd made during those early planning sessions, but had exceeded them in ways that were reshaping Meridian Technologies' position in the consulting industry. More importantly, we had proven that success didn't require sacrificing principles or compromising values. We had built something extraordinary by focusing on results rather than politics, by prioritizing substance over appearance, and by treating every team member as a valuable contributor, regardless of their position in the organizational hierarchy. Marcus Rodriguez had successfully completed the training program he'd proposed and was now contributing meaningfully to our technical documentation processes. Jennifer Walsh had developed expertise in data visualization and was managing client communications for our most complex projects. David Kim had transitioned to a role in our business development team, where his networking skills were genuinely valuable rather than simply performative. But the most satisfying change was the transformation in how people throughout the company approached their work. The success of the Digital Innovation Division had created a new standard for excellence, innovation, and collaborative achievement that was influencing every department and every project. As I concluded the team meeting and watched 43 professionals disperse to work on projects that would impact millions of people and generate hundreds of millions of dollars in value, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't the recognition or the authority or even the financial success. The greatest victory was the knowledge that competence and character had ultimately prevailed over politics and appearances, that hard work and strategic thinking had created opportunities for everyone who was willing to embrace them, and that the quiet woman from the basement had built something that would outlast any individual career or organizational change. The elevator doors closed behind me as I headed home for the evening, but unlike 3 years ago, I wasn't invisible anymore. I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do, surrounded by people who understood that the most powerful victories are the ones that create opportunities for others, rather than simply advancing personal interests. And tomorrow there would be new challenges, new opportunities, and new ways to prove that excellence, integrity, and strategic thinking will always triumph over assumptions, prejudices, and the limitations that other people try to impose on those they underestimate. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.